Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Tales and Tactics Beyond the Book, a show that breaks down the fundamental concepts behind tabletop games and how they're played. I am your host, Max, and joining me is my co-host, Troy, and of course, behind the scenes, working diligently as always, is our producer, Jay. Today's episode is about, adaptation, and as it pertains to games specifically. So we're talking about, how do you interpret things like history or other fictional settings, and how is that done in games that we already play, and what's a good way to adapt something, and what is maybe like a more, I don't know if there's a questionable way, but there are certainly things that apply to different people's tastes. Some people are willing to go really far with adaptation, and some people want something that's a bit more tightly controlled. Maybe the poor wording for that, but yeah. Troy, what's your initial thoughts on adaptation?
The big question with adaptation is are you doing it to depict the subject as your primary topic, or are you doing it to have fun, and this is the window dressing for the fun? So let's compare and contrast different war games, right? You have a game like General d'Armée 2, right? That is an intensely detailed, realistic account of being a Napoleonic commander, right? And then you can compare that to Black Powder, which is, again, a very satisfying, extremely fun game, but at a different level of authenticity. And both can be used to depict the same thing, but what are you looking to get out of it? Are you looking to have a really fun time that looks like the thing? Or are you looking to take away lessons about the thing? And I kind of feel like adaptation, you almost need to know right from the outset what you're trying to do. Are you looking like the thing and it's more about the experience and the thematics, the vibe per se? Or are you actually trying to depict something in a more meaningful capacity to maybe learn from it?
Yeah, I think that the one consistent thing that I try to look for and is the most meaningful, whether you choose to be very authentic to the subject matter or if you're just using it as an aesthetic, is that you know something about that.
Yes.
There's a certain amount of, like, even if you're only applying it in an aesthetic, I feel you can still tell when it's a in-depth view of that thing that has then been pared down to be more focused on the actual game aspect. And then when it's basically nobody's looked into the history of it, nobody's read the lore, and they're just sort of like, oh, that looks cool. At that point, you're just making your own thing that pretends to be. And I think that might be the pitfall of adaptation. That's the negative interpretation, is when, even if it's only the veneer of whatever that thing is, you haven't done the work.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess with the veneer, it's a little harder to tell. And ultimately, really, for a game, what matters is that it's fun to play. But if you are adapting something, I think it's really important that you know what that thing is, even if you only use like 5% of it.
Yeah, it's like the choice to adapt something, whether it be historical or a fictional setting or what have you, is a choice to engage with that. So make it a meaningful choice that you know something about that subject or are prepared to learn about it. Like if you're going to do for example, if you're going to do Normandy in World War II and depict Northwest Europe, right?
Okay, good example. Yeah.
You can just put down a couple trees, a farm, have some American GIs versus some Wehrmacht Germans, right? And just have a firefight over that farm and know nothing else. But if you want to get the real juice out of that, just like pick one slice of the real subject matter to know about. Like you don't need to know the whole thing. Maybe just type into Wikipedia Operation Cobra. You know what I mean?
Mm.
And just like pick the tiniest piece and know that. And maybe just in knowing that, your adaptation or your perspective on the adaptation will be that much more enriched.
Yeah, there's a philosophy that I like to refer to as this is my corner.
Oh, yeah.
Is basically exactly what you're talking about. And it applies to fantastical settings as well. And some games let you find that corner. They leave those sort of undetermined spaces between big events.
Yeah.
This is something that GW's historically really good at. There's this broad sweeping narrative that happens, but there are these little places that are either by lack of description or intentionally left open so that you can play your own thing. And there are some games that cultivate that. Like a good example of this is the Rogue Trader role-playing game.
Oh, yeah.
So, like, there's all this narrative going on in this area, and then we have the Calixis sector, right? And that's, like, way off on the edge. It has all the things that you would want to find in the main setting, but you're not built around certain things happening at certain times and being pulled into the conflict, which is not appropriate for a Rogue Trader type campaign, if that makes sense. Because a lot of what Rogue Traders are doing are going out into uncharted places and then finding and making use of the exploits of those new found lands, for lack of a better word.
I don't want to cut you off or divert here, but you made an interesting point. When you're in, I guess, to describe it this way, someone else's setting, how careful do you have to be about creating an Avengers level threat? Like, let's say you're in the Warhammer 40,000 setting. Like, did you just create a thing that Guilliman himself would pivot towards fighting? Like, why is it your cast in your corner that's dealing with this world-shaking galactic event? Like, is that something to think about in, like, do you have to, when you're doing an adaptation, do you have to adhere to some greater concept of canonicity that applies across everyone also engaging with this setting? Or are you in your own pocket anyways, so you can do anything you want, and you never would have to think, like, what's John doing over there? Like, it doesn't matter what he's doing. He's not in your pocket. It's your corner. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think it really comes down to how much the people you're playing with are willing to bend and break the setting. There's I'm reminded of there's a theory of time travel, like a narrative theory of time travel, which is maybe one of the more recent ones, which I think is accidentally described. Not accidentally, sorry, it's intentionally described, but not finitely enough in Back to the Future 1 and 2.
Oh.
2 more essentially. So the idea is that, Marty does all the things that he does and then goes back in time, but because he did one thing, they're on an alternate timeline. If I remember the more finer point theory, which I think is sort of an extension of chaos theory, is that merely the act of going back in time and being there, you don't even need to interact with anything. You actually just going back in time immediately creates another timeline you can't escape. It's I think I've heard it referred to it, I don't know if it's an actual term for it, but the association of it's the type of time travel where you could never go home.
Oh, okay.
Right? Because you'll only ever go on to, because your time traveling is an anomaly in time space, you'll only ever go to another offshoot timeline that you create by the act of traveling through time. I know that's a bit ropey, but it's kind of like, are you okay with that concept being in your game, that like, by me doing different things or having a significant effect on this universe, or if we're playing historical games, actual timelines, the butterfly effect that comes off of that, are you okay with either handling or hand-waving that whole thing?
That's really interesting. No, I know what you mean, because it's like in your private campaign where you're like in your own subsector of the galaxy, does a Primarch ever phone in and be like, hey, I'm here, by the way. Keep doing that thing you're doing. I'm hanging up now. Like, and does that change anything if he does, right? Like, let's assume that Robert Guilliman phones you and tells you, like, hey, punch that chaos guy. And you're like, I'm already on the way. He's like, great. Talk to you later. Does that, like, by doing that, does that matter at all to a greater context? Or does that like add weight to your story? Like, it's this thing of like, when you're playing in a setting, you're adapting something, you want to play with the levers of that thing, right? And it's like, but it also is sort of like, the funny thing is like, if you're playing a Marvel superheroes game, right? And you're in New York, why isn't Spidey jumping in to fight this villain? Like, what is he doing in this moment that's so much more important than what you're doing if this guy's also going to sink Manhattan?
So I think that's one of the... Sorry, I was partly distracted by the idea of, like, Robot Gilliman picking up a psyker and using them like a telephone.
With his big power fist.
Yeah, just like holding this like guy up to his head. Hey, I'm coming in. No, but, you know, that's a good point. And it depends on... Like, different settings handle heroic characters in a different way. I think the safe thing to do is to know that those characters are out there doing those things. You respect that that's moving the meta plot forward, and that may affect yours. It's very touch and go when you start bringing those characters in and you start having interactions. There's actually this is a weird thing. There's this comic book that is Star Wars comics. Probably one, I don't know if it's my favorite, but it's definitely up there for inventiveness. And it's this two-part, it's literally just 2 issues. It's like a one-off thing. It's called Tag and Bink Are Dead.
Oh.
And it is 2 characters. They're kind of like a buddy cop team. And it's a comedy. It's like a comedic take on the original Star Wars movies. And it's these 2 characters that I think start off as rebels and then somehow end up on the Death Star while all of the other stuff is happening, and they have to disguise themselves as stormtroopers. And the main characters of Star Wars interact with them not knowing who they are.
Oh, that's very funny.
It's a parallel narrative. Now, again, that works better in a comedic context. And there's all these call-outs to things, and I think it's such a short run, it's pretty hard to find. I have it around here somewhere, but that's one way of handling that, where your characters are interacting with these heroes, these larger-than-life figures, at least as far as the fiction goes. Like, if you were to take Luke Skywalker at face value, you wouldn't think that, but we all know Luke Skywalker is an important character.
Exactly.
It's safe to have those interactions so long as your player is in the supporting role, but therein lies the danger. If you spend too much time around Spider-Man and Iron Man, do they suddenly just take over the plot and now the GM is just playing with his action figures while everybody watches?
That's one outcome. Or you could do what Dark Forces did, to make another Star Wars reference, and you could have Luke Skywalker say to Cal Katarn, "Not even I can interfere with your destiny now."
Oh, sure, right.
It's like you could go the other way completely and just dunk on the existing characters and make them insignificant. So, okay. To go back to the topic of our last week's discussion, The Lord of the Rings, in the One Ring game, they directly introduce these characters as patrons. So Gandalf is there, and you're meant to talk to him because he's your quest giver. But it directly puts you in a relationship to them in such a way as to cement their role in that setting, right? It's like by not making them a patron, it almost could have been messier than by specifically making you have to talk to Gandalf. You know what I mean? I mean, you don't have to per se, but him being one of the featured patrons makes that interaction more likely. And it's almost like it's better that they know that's going to happen and control for it and just make it a thing, as opposed to various iterations of the Star Wars RPG that have just put Darth Vader in it with a stat line and given you no context for it and just said, hey, figure out some silly gamey way to kill this guy. Like, you know what I mean?
Actually, that reminds me of a thing that I'll ask you. What is your feeling of, and this will go to like a Dungeons and Dragons context, which is, I think, a point that most people will understand. Should gods have stat lines?
Never, in my opinion.
Right. My
problem with that is because I don't think you can kill a god by knocking its HP down. Like, you could maybe stab a god, but it's not because you did 22 HP damage to it. It's because the dagger was magical in a mythical capacity. You know, it's like, it's not that gods are infallible or indestructible or beyond reproach. It's just that the way in which that you would interact with them, in my opinion, would be so metaphysical that giving them a number is so arbitrary and meaningless that that's not what matters about them.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, I think if you take the idea that what you have killed is simply an avatar and the true essence of that thing is more like a platonic form of whatever the god represents, and then it manifests, I think that's sort of the happy, safe point on that, where you can, you're not getting too like, oh, but then people, well, not people. There's the whole story about when they released deities and demigods, and then people were coming up to them in conventions, be like, "Well, my character killed Thor, and so I have Thor's hammer now." And I'm like, well, to be fair, that actually brings up the fact of what mythology you're talking about, because if you're playing a Norse mythological game, Norse gods feel more people oriented, like they feel more tangible in that way. Thor feels more like a person, though with godlike powers, more like a superhero. In fact, I often think that may be an interjection on Jack Kirby's part, in that he literally put Norse gods in Marvel, but I think he took a lot of influence from the idea that Norse gods have that tangible.
Yeah, they're not quite so Zeus.
There's less of this removed feeling, but there's a caveat to Norse mythology, which is Ragnarok. Everybody's got to be present who's fabled to be involved, which is everybody to some extent. I know people are going to say, oh, but Baldur's dead. I'm like, well, that's the inciting incident. So shut up. He's coming back. It's that alternate timeline thing. Like if we take it back to historical context, and you're playing a World War II campaign, and you're playing as Axis powers, and you start to win the campaign, it's like, well, we're just going to have to embrace, we're going full Wolfenstein, right?
Yeah, that's actually really funny. Like, you make a really good point, because in a historical game, if you're just doing a historical campaign, you've completely forked in the road now. Like, oh, we didn't march on Madrid, we went west. You know what I mean?
In a war game, it is more about the battles and the tactical movements. Again, there's parallel play where you might also be playing a role-playing game. I rarely see that with historical strategy. It's not impossible, right? Like Brownsteins were effectively a loose form of role play that then overlapped onto a strategy game.
I would love to see more of that again. Like, I love the idea of role-playing in a war game. It's just, they don't always, like, it's like one of them has to backseat and you have to pick. And it's not always obvious which one it should be. And not everyone always agrees in a campaign context. But I love when you can mix those two components. And sometimes some settings and adaptational materials will give you that.
Wargamers, not all wargamers. There are definitely ambitious wargamers that like to bring in a lot of elements. But I would jokingly say that quite a number of people who do wargaming and don't do role-playing have commitment issues. And I don't mean in a relationship sense. I mean like, oh, I just want to play this game and have some fun and then walk away, like, however it ended, and we can all shake hands and do it again sometime. But yeah, as soon as you bring a role-playing or a narrative element, even if you're just using like heroic characters, like I'm not a fan of how this is done in Chain of Command, but the fact that you can have named commanders and that they have like previous backstory, I like that idea. I wish it had a little bit of mechanical, be a little bit less like window dressing and have actually some substance to it.
Oh yeah.
Even if it's just a subtle thing. Actually, an example I think that you were mentioning is that in Chain, at least the original version, each faction has its own advantages and disadvantages. And I don't remember you were mentioning, I don't know if that it's something in second edition or if it's in a different game, where those advantages and disadvantages are more based on the company or the battalion or some smaller.
Yeah, that's the French handbook for 1940. It's based on your unit type. So if you're like a first wave infantry division of the Germans, you'll actually have different advantages and disadvantages, like characteristics, than other guys in other waves or division types.
Yeah. So my suggestion on so I actually like that. I mean, I know there's this idea that it's like, oh, well, there's a nationalistic characteristic for the Germans versus the Americans. And to a certain extent, that's true. But I don't think you have to play it that way. And it generally comes off as a generalization, which I don't have a problem with per se, but I don't think that's the only way to perceive those things.
Yeah, I think national characteristics are like helpful in some capacities, but you really want to instead like consider the fact that these national characteristics are only appropriate when you're considering certain time periods, because the complexity of warfare is different in different periods of time. And these national characteristics might work if you're looking at, say, 1066, the Battle of Hastings, right? You might be able to simplify that to like the English forces at Hastings were like this. You could do that. But in World War II, because of the complexity of the forces involved, it's like, can you say that all Commonwealth divisions are effectively 5 rounds rapid and can shoot their rifles that much better? Like, is that such a blanket statement? Or is that something that should be localized to a certain type of British division or Canadian division or what have you, right? So that's where it's another question to have in adaptation too, right? Like something I want to do actually, if you don't mind, is I do want to talk about how do you take a specific thing and adapt it yourself.
Just to finish my point on what we were talking about, I also think that like the individual heroic character should bring one of those unit attributes. So one of them might be the regiment based, and then the effect of your commander has like a secondary effect.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, the digression aside. Sorry, what was your question?
How do you go about the process of doing an adaptation yourself?
It really depends on what you're adapting and to what degree. So do you mean like
what I'm looking at is a battle. Like if I'm going to adapt a historical battle, some of the things you want to do are you want to know the context of your battle.
Yeah.
You want to understand the at least a rudimentary outline of the historical figures involved, why they're meeting, what this battle represents, some of the history. Otherwise, my argument would be just set up a make-believe. If you don't know, then what's the difference, right? But if you're going to learn something, learn it. Get a little bit into it. There's a lot of free resources. You can spend 15 minutes reading something online, and you can take away a basic outline. It's not going to get you through a university level course, but you'll know something.
Yeah, I guess not to cut you off, but the question really comes down to is what is the purpose of authenticity in this? Is it to be educational? Is it to add verisimilitude?
See, that was a point that I made right at the top. Like, when you're going to adapt something, you got to know right away, is it for the expression of that subject in a way as to take something away from it? Or is it more aesthetic? And I would say if you're doing something historic, you got to do it with the intent to take something away. Because the aesthetics of it, I mean, you don't have to, obviously. Everyone is, up to do what makes them happy. But what I'm trying to say is, if you're going to spend the time to depict a historical subject, it's meaningful to know about it and depict it with a little bit of intent as to take something away. Like, it'd be like playing a World War II game to me without using historical formations. It's like, what's the point?
Right.
Because, you get something. Not that you have to do it like it's some rote educational exercise and that we're pretending we're scholars. Like, we're not trying to do that per se. But it's like when I play a game of Chain of Command, and I'm the Brits and I'm attacking a farmhouse and I'm trying to get my smoke mortar, my 2-inch, to deploy and everything. Like, it's imparting to me something of that, as opposed to if I just had like 50 riflemen, 4 M4s, and I just like wave attacked the farm. You know what I mean? Like, and I'm not going to name another game like one's better than the other per se. Everyone's got their preference. But I mean to say, I want the historical intent to be taken away so that I can learn something. And if I wasn't there to learn something from the adaptation, I don't need to do an adaptation.
Yeah, well, and I don't think it's an either or thing. And the way that I like to think about it isn't whether it's more or less historical, because less historical is in aid of what is that in aid of? It's taking away from this to give to what I would generally say is gameplay, right? So it's a similar argument between a simulationist view of design versus an arcade view of design.
Yeah.
Right. So is the game more focused on being a game, or is it more trying to represent something in an extremely accurate fashion? I think you have to kind of pick and choose.
Yeah.
Like, for instance, there's games that focus a lot on different aspects of like the fog of war.
Yes.
And I mean that broadly. I mean in the sense of like what you know and what you don't know, using probabilistic outcomes. Again, we play a lot of chains, so I'll use that as an example. But the idea that you have these jump-off markers that are kind of like abstract troop, well, more like scouting movements.
Yep.
And when you place something on the board, you don't have to walk it from edge of table. You actually have a measurement off of something, which is your jump-off marker, the truck, usually represented by a truck that brought everybody there. But even that is abstract, right? That's technically not there, though it does represent like
it could be.
It could exist there, or it might just represent like a resource of that unit existing. But it doesn't mean that when you have that jump off that everything is fixed on that point. You can pick and choose what comes out of there, with the exception of vehicles, because naturally that requires context. It's like, oh yeah, that tank was always there, and maybe as a defender that might be believable, but
like a hull down tank or something, like a Stug in cover. Yeah, I get you.
Yeah, or it's been tarped and it's like secretly hidden there.
Yeah.
There's in BattleTech there's scenarios that describe mechs that are in shutdown and not detectable, and then you can like basically activate them, and now there's new units on the board.
Oh, that's cool.
Right. So they were always there until, you know, like now you notice them.
Yeah.
I guess that's sort of similar to, what is it, the Quantum Ogre?
Yes.
You know that?
Yes.
That's more of a role-playing thing, but it's like, well, the party has to encounter the ogre, so it doesn't matter if they go left or right, because they won't know the difference between doing one or the other if they pick that they're going to end up encountering it. And in game design, I think I've heard it more as bottlenecking.
Yes.
Right. So, and that's from level design, where you have a starting point. This is like the Doom map style.
Oh yeah.
You have a starting point. You have a branching set of ways you can go, and then it narrows down on an exit. Right. So you start and end exactly the same way, but it's the middle navigational part, or how you handle enemies. And I don't mean like literally, because I know that on a Doom map there are like corridors and you have to go through stuff and there's backtracking, but more in the decision making sense. It's like, oh, I can approach this group of enemies and try to take them out, and then I'll go around this way and collect these items. But ultimately you're going to end up at the exit. I've seen strategy campaigns, like a ladder campaign works that way.
Oh, okay.
For people that don't know, a ladder campaign is, the simplest form is 5 map layouts, and each one of them is a separate battle that, depending how the outcome of one of them goes, it begins the next one. So you sort of see each player at each end of the ladder, and then they usually start in the middle. And then if you lose the middle one, now you move back. Like the loser loses ground, and now the next battle is closer on the map, closer to them.
Yeah, you tug a war across the rungs of your ladder, starting at whatever rung that's appropriate, right? And then that type of campaign that's actually a really good type of campaign to apply as an adaptation method to historical stuff too, by the way, as a brief aside.
It's a good structure. And I think that actually sort of says a good way of adapting those sorts of things. Like, if you are doing it yourself, keep it simple, pick your corner, manage your expectations. And I think you'll probably be all right.
Yeah, that's great advice. Like, basically, it's know what you want to get out of it when you start and aim for that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of what I mean between the differences of trying to do something with a dedication to verisimilitude, or something with a dedication more to like the characteristic or vibe of the subject. It's like you got to know what you want out of an adaptation, right? Like, that's what's most important, because like if you're going to do like you could do a nameless platoon versus a nameless platoon in Normandy, or you could very specifically have like, this is 18 platoon of this battalion at this specific location. It's this crossroads. Like I've played campaigns where what we did is we brought up Google Earth and we used that we took pictures, like, and we used the layouts to create maps to fight over based on the rough impression of where we had an understanding, like, oh, okay, we know this unit fought across this stretch of farmland as a part of this operation. So let's just like look at this and snap it out. And the Two Fat Lardies, Richard Clark, he gives some really great insight in how to do this in the At the Sharp End Chain of Command campaign supplement. They talk a lot about creating your own campaign adaptations. But by doing this, you get this personal perspective that you wouldn't otherwise get by not getting this deep into an adaptation. And again, if you just want to see guys that look like World War II guys fight other World War II guys, that can be very satisfying in its own regard. And whatever game system you enjoy to reach that end, go for it. But like when you take an adaptation and you do it with a little bit more heat and you can actually get deeper and you look at a map and you're like, wow, it was hard to control this crossroads because of the hill overlooking it and the limited cover and that stupid barn over there. Like, you know what I mean? Like it gives you more value. When you're adapting a specific battle, I like to look at the orders of battle and like try and figure out like specifically what would be a cool way to represent this. Like I mentioned 1066 Battle of Hastings earlier. It's kind of a Dark Age battle, so it's an easy one to reference because of the simplicity of troop types, because it's basically like feared or housecarls, right? On the English side, like it was two types of troops. But you basically look at like how many guys there are and you figure out what your base unit is representative of. So we'll take a look at a game like Hail Caesar. That's a really popular game. It's by Warlord Games. It's the sister game of Black Powder.
Okay. Yeah.
Bolt Action. Rick Priestley designed it. So it's a classic. And in that game, what you would do is you would kind of think like, okay, what is my spearmen? I have a block of spearmen. What is that? Is that like 600 guys? Is that 1,000 guys? And we'll take a look here. So the English side on the Battle of Hastings had between 5,000 to 13,000 participants. So let's set that at 10,000. If we have each of our units of spearmen as 1,000 man blocks, now we have 10 units. 10 units can divide into 3 contingents or 3 divisions by 3, right? So 3 with 1 extra being your companions, your general's bodyguard, your Retuan, right? And that right there, we're taking a historical number of troops, we're basing it on a real event, but we're trying to map it onto our forces so that when we go, we don't need to do this. We could just pick some cool stuff and say it's this battle. But by actually looking at least the most scant reference, you can really start to find this. So like now we know, okay, so we got 10 blocks of troops. We would look at what we know there's 10,000. So what made these guys up, right? We know that it's feared and housecarls, right? They formed the backbone of the forces. So the feared, they were just the main organizing unit. So they could have, it was like a temporary formation. So it wasn't professional troops like the housecarls. So there'd probably be a lot more of them. So you could probably like either try and find more detailed accounts than what I have in front of me, or what you can do is use your best historical knowledge or even just the collection you have, but you're still trying to base it off of the information or something like tangible that you can grip to, right? So we'll say that maybe 7,000 or 7 of our 10 units are feared, and then we'll have our housecarls as our last 3 units, and then that final one could be the King's Men, right? And that's a little bit of a anachronism, perhaps. Yeah,
kind of a simplification.
Yeah, but this is just a really fast way to take a look at a real battle, a real historical reference to the troops present, and try and convert that into a game. And you could do this in, like, when you're doing a World War II game, there's way more detailed orders of battle available, right? You'll know what division it was, what battalions were present, how many companies were there, and what their platoons were made out of, you know? And then you can really get in on that. But by taking a look at the actual information that you're going to extrapolate your game content from, you can do something that's much more rewarding than just making it look like the thing, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, I think that's the appeal of adaptation in a lot of cases, whether that's historical or fictional, is the fact that there's something there that kind of gets your imagination going. Like, you, even if you're not a fan, it's like, oh, hey, I can bounce off of this. And I'm often fascinated when games make a version of it. Like they make something that's more flexible for the purposes of being able to do that adaptation yourself without having to make, like, going back to the idea of like, and we were talking about like, oh, the butterfly effect. I was actually just remembered another example of that, which is Starfleet Battles.
Oh, perfect. Yes.
For people that don't know, Starfleet Battles is Star Trek, basically a ship-to-ship strategy game. When it was pitched originally, the people who were managing Star Trek weren't super keen on the idea of like a warfare game, being in their setting, because Star Trek is more about that problem solving, diplomacy, and like eventually if it comes to a fight, then it comes to a fight. But it's not like there's constantly conflict, and that's what a war game needs to, as a setting, to have that momentum where you're like, oh, I want to have, Klingons fighting the Federation
in the grim darkness of the far future, right?
Yeah, all the time. So what they settled on was that there's basically an alternate timeline, which is called Starfleet Battles, which is essentially the Federation at war. And you don't have to use it that way. You can use the Starfleet Battles rules to then play out a Star Trek situation that may have actually happened. Like, I mean, I know there's multiple editions of that. I'm going like this came out toward, I think it was after the original series.
Yes.
But before TNG. So, but there have been additional adaptations of things. And oddly enough, warfare is a bigger thing in the more recent series. Like if you wanted to do like the Dominion War, that's something that's actually happening in the setting. So you could take those rules and apply it to the actual setting. I mean, this goes back to the fact that nobody can stop you from playing the game however you want. That's why I always find any notes written in, and it's like, well, we don't want people playing this, that, and the other way. I'm like, you have no authority to do that, whether you have good intentions or not.
Only the dice are in charge, Only the dice tell us what happens.
Or the player. Like, you can, if you want to do your weird version of alternate, like, World War II history and really play into that, I mean, it's happening at your table as long as everybody is into it.
Well, that's what a lot of the weird war games are, right? They're just like these totally crazy alternative histories. And you can do, like, that's actually a huge thing in Enlightenment and Napoleonic era gaming, is doing like alternate histories and imaginations, as the term is called lovingly, where it's like fake countries that are painted in outrageous colors having battles.
Mm.
And that's kind of like a way around adaptation in a funny way, but it is a cool way to do like your own alternative histories and your own materials, right?
And there's some settings that are entirely born out of like absurd concept. Like, here's an interesting one. Like, there's a difference in you personally adapting something that was something before it was a game versus something that was a game intentionally. So like, there's a difference between playing Star Wars versus playing Space 1889.
Yes.
Because Star Wars has this timeline that runs through it. There's also like things where it's like, like Star Wars being that it was a film first and then it was all these other things. But that doesn't always have to apply in that sense, because the role-playing game itself can actually have a narrative that runs through it. So there's some oddities in there, like Legend of the Five Rings. Its initial timeline is built off of a card game.
Oh, yeah, I love that. Yeah, the initial plot of that game. Yeah.
And it's like, well, you don't think that should matter where the origins of the plot are, whether they are built within the scope of the game. I think the only thing that is somewhat accommodated in doing that is that if it's made as a role-playing game, even if it has a meta plot or a history to it, it's usually designed so that you can find your corner or interact with it in a way where the stakes aren't quite as high. Whereas if it's something like a film or a book, then it's going to have that. It might be just as flexible, but it's not going to feel as flexible.
Yeah, no, that's true, because there are more specifically written in main cast, bespoke, crucial timeline events.
Yeah, major events that happen.
Yeah.
There's some examples of that where it sort of kind of tries to meet it halfway. Battletech is a good example.
Battletech is a really good example.
Where it's a game. It has these major events for the sake of being able to figure things out. They broke it into eras. I mean, you could do this in like the original game when these things are coming out, but it would be more down to the specific date. Like, are you playing 3025? Are you playing 3051? Right?
Right.
Something about how the game is set up, I feel, gives license. And I'm speaking about fiction here. History is weird. History occupies this space where it's so serious and it's so factual that the freedom to do what you want with it comes out of the fact that, like, it comes more out of that what if. It's more of a man in the high castle kind of like, oh yeah, like, it's without a doubt, this was how it, like, we might not know every detail about what was going on, but these were the results. We live in the future of that event.
Yes. Well, that's why I like to play small in historical. Like, I like to play skirmish games, platoon level games, and company level games instead of playing all the biggest battalist. Oh man, horizon to horizon armies. Because I love that in my fantasy gaming and in my sci-fi gaming. Like, don't get me wrong, I love epic scale.
Mm-hmm.
But when we're talking about historical gaming, it's like the butterfly effect. If this brigade wasn't the brigade that fought that battle, it was a different brigade, just because of the way your campaign or your battle line or whatever happened, you've just changed history in ways that we won't ever know. And does that matter at your gaming table? Probably absolutely not. But it is food for thought in engaging with adaptation, right?
Well, I have a question for you
Hit me.
In this sense.
Yeah.
When it comes to established settings, say in a role-playing game, let's take Forgotten Realms, because I know you've run games in that.
Yeah.
We both have.
Presently doing it.
Yeah, exactly. When it's an established role-playing setting, like, what's your approach? Like, how much of the actual... Because I consider this to be sometimes a hurdle, depending on how it's presented, which is, how much of the world do I need to actually learn about?
Yes.
It's like, especially it's a fictional setting. Like, it's not something where, like, I engage with history because it seems relevant, both in a day-to-day practical understanding of the world, and also because I'm interested in it.
Yeah.
But if you're investing in a fictional setting, there's, like, this is one of my criticisms of Legend of the Five Rings, was I really like this game, but man, to feel like I'm doing it justice, I really gotta read a lot of stuff.
Yeah, 100%. And like, okay, so this is what I was doing in my Forgotten Realms campaign, is I had created a pocket little area called the Vale Lands. And that was kind of my own little adventuring zone. We had our town called Glenshire, and then we had all of our little people around there, and we had a dragon, we had all this stuff. But then people wanted to go to Waterdeep, because I mentioned it. So then I had to look at the map of Sword Coast and figure out, like, am I on this map or am I adjacent to this map? And when you go to the far eastern side of that map, the topography really changes from what I had been describing. So I found in the Northlands, there was actually like a sort of a river meeting point where three rivers met. And I was like, oh, that's kind of what I described in the Vale Lands.
Mm-hmm.
And it was in the north. It was about a 17-day journey based on a map that I had found online to get to Waterdeep, which was like still pretty far for, on foot, but still believable for the Forgotten Realms setting, right? Like, maybe if you're doing historical, that would be quite a journey. But like in Forgotten Realms, people are doing all types of stuff. So whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So I picked this place on the map that didn't have a town. It was just empty. And I said, that's where our town is. And then when they were journeying, I looked at the first real town on the map, brought up the wiki, saw the named mayor of the town, the barbarian chief, because it turned out to be a barbarian town. I didn't know that. So I was like, oh, this is a barbarian town, I guess. And then I saw the name of the chief and I was like, cool, let's go. And we just started to improvise based on the facts that were available.
Right. So you kind of got dragged into using the setting more than, but then you found a way to make that more adaptable to what you wanted to play.
And I found, because we have tools like wikis and D&D Beyond and all these things, you don't really need to know everything when you go into it. Like, there's an expectation for a lot of game masters, especially when or a lot of war gamers when they're going into a period, that they have to know the whole thing. Like, oh, before I can paint my first Napoleonic soldier, I better understand how Napoleon supplied his troops on the march to Russia. It's like,
oh, yeah.
you don't need to. And the same thing applies to doing an adaptation or a gaming session in like Faerun. Like, you don't need to necessarily know who the High Lord of Waterdeep is to start a game in Waterdeep, right? You don't need to know all these facts, because in our world today, we have the internet, we have the convenience of being able to grab this fast. So if you're at your table with, say, a laptop or a phone or what have you, you may be able to do quick calls. You can even use tools like ChatGPT and other assets to help you with this. And what can happen is you can be in someone else's world without having to know it all and still call on meaningful things that you didn't have to generate on your own. Like, I thought it was really cool that we found a barbarian village in the north. Like, that to me was awesome. We're like, oh, this totally changed the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
They were on a journey to Waterdeep with a caravan that they managed to make a deal with, right? Like with these traders. So I thought we'd stop over in this town, they'd trade in the morning, and they'd leave to go to the next town, right? But they ended up like staging a coup in this town because it so turned out the barbarian king was corrupt. And it just said one line in the wiki that his hut was way nicer than everybody else's. And it was like, and the players just took that as like, wait a second, that's not fair. That's messed up. What's this guy doing? And then it turned out that I was like, oh, maybe he is doing something. Maybe he's friends with the bandits you guys are mad at. Maybe that's why he's rich, because he's taking bandit money. And it just like kind of started to roll. But it was just through using the materials available. I didn't feel like I was totally wrapped into having to know everything. But importantly, to riff off something I did say earlier, I have read books in the Forgotten Realms. I did have a knowledge. Like I've read my R.A. Salvatore's when I was young, right? So I know enough about the world that I'm able to improvise within it pretty comfortably, but I don't have to know every stepping stone because the information is there.
Right.
Like if you have a foundation and you know where to access the information, you're good to go. Like that's how a lot of us live our professional lives. It's like we're not perfect experts at our jobs, but we know enough and we know how to find the information and we go from there.
That's my take on how to deal with rules in a game as well. There's a certain baseline of rules, but then like I think the way that I go is that you don't need to know everything right now.
Right.
That's the little caveat that I add to the end of that, which is like we were saying, like in our last BTB, it was, well, I don't like the mercantile aspect. I want to go on the travel part. I'm like, well, the mercantile aspect and the travel part are two separate parts. So you can treat one with some level of fidelity, and then you just take the results of that and then pass that on to the part where you don't have to think about it anymore. Another interesting, so there's a good point that I think you sort of indicated at when talking about your campaign, which is also what is the most important part to start learning. And I think a really interesting example of this is present in Call of Cthulhu. I have a particular thought on this, which is I think it's more important to understand the era than the mythos.
I agree with you entirely. You need to know the Roaring 20s better than you know what a Shoggoth is, because like you're not going to see monsters very much. It's not a big part of the game ultimately, but a big part of the game is like navigating the streets of whatever that town in Massachusetts is called. I forget. Why do I forget? Arkham.
Oh,
Arkham.
Right. Or no, Miskatonic. Or sorry, not
Miskatonic.
Yeah, Arkham. Sorry, Miskatonic University is within that. Yeah, so it's more about, to me, if you're choosing between the fantastic, and again, it has to do with the way that Lovecraft's mythos functions. Like, it's fun to read about those things, and it's fun to read the stories. But I actually think paying more attention, bringing more reality to the time period, especially for players, it's more like people are like, oh, we're going to play Call of Cthulhu, and I'm not one of these people who's like, you shouldn't read any of the mythos before playing.
Yeah.
That's not how role playing works.
Yeah.
But if we knew what era, because Call of Cthulhu can be played in different eras, as soon as I know what era it is, I brush up on that because I want my normal character to feel like they belong in that place. And my hope is that the other players at least do something. They make that investment as well. And I might know, oh yeah, that's a Dole or that's a Shoggoth or whatever.
Yeah.
That's less of an emphasis for me to play the game. In fact, even GMing it, I'm more interested in making the regular. This is, I think, a quality of like what a good horror movie is.
Right.
A good horror movie invests a lot in the ordinary world so that the horrific and fantastic can feel more horrific and fantastic. And I think it's true of at least paranormal horror games as well. You want to establish normality so that when the absurd stuff happens, it feels like a departure.
That's what's so crazy about playing Delta Green with a good GM.
Oh, yeah.
Is because they're just going to like stop you from doing game things. You're just like, okay, I'm going to ask this guy to see if he gives away any clues. And you're like, what does that mean? What are you talking about? You ask this guy to see if he gives away clues. Tell me specifically what you're saying to him. Make it real. And then when it's not real, it'll feel like something. And I think you're right. There's something to be said about that.
So in priority of like a historical setting that has fantastical elements, I think the history part is more complex usually.
Yeah, true.
I think Call of Cthulhu is a really good example because the mythos implies more complexity, but it doesn't actually have that much complexity. And the ordinary world seems mundane, but if it's not your own actual setting, then it's actually quite nuanced.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Otherwise, you end up playing a kind of revisionist or comic booky kind of cartoonish version of that setting. And you know what? If everybody's playing that way, that's fine. But as somebody that likes history and gets a lot out of the different little aspects and minutia, and I don't even mean just like from a militaristic or weapon point of view, but like what are the manners and fashions and politics of that era? And might not want to get
even the food.
Yeah. Like I don't want to get too embroiled in it, right? Because that could be a huge distraction. But that's what's going to make my character feel more like a character in that world. And immersion is not something that necessarily the GM brings to you. It's also something that everybody brings to the table in a role-playing game, right?
There's a famous thing in wargaming like, hey, why doesn't your rule tell me how to build my squads historically? And it's like, why don't you build your squads historically without me telling you how to do it?
Why do I have to hold your hand?
Both people bring, right? Both sides bring.
Yeah. I think the designer needs to provide tools and recognize that is a concern, but it's up to the players to basically make use of those rules.
Yeah.
I don't know. Is there something wrong with doing like bolt action where the book is like also a history book? And it's like massively thick. Well, I mean, I don't hate it. It's a good book, but I don't know that you always need that. You might just need, hey, here's how you put together something. Here's a couple examples. And usually that's enough for me. Like, right. With Chain of Command, they don't cover every unit, and there's definitely a high emphasis of British and German based on the authors.
Yeah.
But I was like, oh, well, what about the war in the Pacific? And people, in fact, I think if it wasn't Rich, it was somebody close to the actual design team put out stuff for the Japanese and stuff like that. But then I'm like, but there's all these little things where I'm like, oh, what if I wanted to do like Navy Raiders?
Yeah, totally.
Well, that doesn't exist. And they even have a different command structure because they're more like a commando team. And they have such a niche role in the war overall, but it's cool, right? So it wasn't too hard for me to sort of reverse engineer a lot of the stuff because what they had put into the book wasn't so fixed and bespoke that I couldn't figure that out.
Yeah.
And I think that, like that's me bringing my fun to the table, right?
I'm a big believer in that. You got to show up and bring your fun. And that's why I like campaigns. Like, I know we're sort of diverging from adaptation here, but like campaigns are fun to me because you bring so much energy to them and you're thinking about them and you're more invested in the direction your troops are going, the characters, the survival, the objectives. Like it all means something, even if it's not a map campaign or a ladder campaign, even if it's a narrative campaign where you're sort of playing out the beats of a story together or even solo. Like that's super cool and is totally the thing to do. Like I've been in a Horus Heresy campaign recently, right? And it's been so interesting to be just so invested in these battles because the characters matter so much. And it's not a map game, right? There's no like sector map with pins on it. Like we're on the planet of this. It's just more like, should be this planet next. Okay. Who's there? These two guys. I guess they're fighting. What happens when they do that? And it doesn't matter that it's so loose. It still feels really rewarding because there is some definition to at least the characters and the forces and the names of the planets, even if it's not like I'm moving 6 hexes to get there, you know?
Yeah.
But that's oftentimes what is not, like you don't remember moving 6 hexes. You remember the battle, you remember the feelings, you remember the takeaways, but you don't necessarily remember like, oh yeah, it was specifically this number of movement points to get around the hill. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's why my opinions on campaigns have changed a lot over the years. Like when I was doing an adaptation originally and I wanted to take a battle or a subject and make a campaign out of it, like I would find like 4 rule books and have all these D100 tables all assembled to be like, all right, I'm ready to do a turn 1. And it would take like 2 weeks and it would suck and it would not be fun. And now my process is like so freeform, and there still are maps I can reference, but it's not like anyone is so specifically plotted as to be in this grid square. You know what I mean?
Yeah. You don't have to track everything. You can keep it in a probabilistic space. And for your own sanity, I think that's usually a good idea.
Yeah. And by doing so, there's a certain amount of like organic flexibility you can also achieve, right? Where things aren't quite so like you don't have ships pass in the night quite so easily. You know what I mean? Where you're like, oh, we were 1 hex apart and we just didn't have the movement points and we glided past each other and it kind of felt awkward.
Right.
You never have that, right? Because it's not about those peculiarities. It's more about achieving the specific targeted outcomes as opposed to just like stumbling into something that we happen to get because of the way the equation of the game worked. A lot of times when you're doing, like sometimes that's the point of it, right? Like they're really fun. Like, okay, there's a game called Blucher. Blucher, sorry. It's a Napoleonic big battle game where you're like a corps commander, and it has an 8x6 grid that you play on first before you play your tabletop miniatures game. You play this little 8x6 square little grid where you move stacks that represent the troops of your army, and you have like 3 or 4 of these stacks and you move them around, and once they get within proximity of each other and you create a 6 or a 3x2 rectangle, that's the battlefield, and then you set up the table. So that's a perfect example of like you not going into it with a specific intention but creating an intention through the equation of the game itself. And that's super rewarding. And that's why map play is fun.
Right.
But that game makes it does the whole chain of command patrol phase technique, but it does it with a map sheet before the start of the game. So it's really clever, just as a brief aside on that. But that's an example of it being like derived specifically through mechanics. But where I have been lately is it's been narratively derived where I'm going with my battles and stuff. And that's how I've done this Horus Heresy campaign.
Right.
And it's been super rewarding. Like I've had like it's Thousand Suns versus Space Wolves versus, you know, allies. But it's really led to like rivalries and heroic characters, like an Imperialis militia character taking out a Sentinel. And now, like, that guy's my guy. I love that guy now. You know what I mean? And it's just because of the experience of the campaign. And the choice to play it in that more flexible way was part of my choice in how to adapt the setting to this specific campaign. And by making that choice, I'm emphasizing what I specifically want, which if I was doing a historical campaign, to pivot a little bit that way, I'd want the verisimilitude. I'd want to have an intended takeaway from that experience. But when I'm doing something that's a little bit more freeform, a little bit more fantastical, I'm much more interested in achieving the set pieces without having to go through the rigmarole, we'll call it.
No, I get that. I think my final thoughts on this is just, if you're playing in a group, like, again, a solo game, like what you've been doing, you can go any way that feels right to you. If you really want to get into that detail and make sure that everything is technically placed and you're putting pins on a map, go for it. When you're doing that with other people, it's something of a negotiation as to how much investment, and if there's a game master involved, there's also a negotiation on how much will I do for the players versus how much will I get involved.
Yes.
Or let them take onto their part. And it's always proportion. They're not going to, unless you're playing like an entirely gamist setting, like you're just doing like a non-canonical dungeon crawl, which is totally fun. That's something that like DCC does. Like you can play a campaign and it doesn't exist in any world that matters.
Yeah, totally.
Like it's your world and only through the pure view of that corner that you're playing the game in. But yeah, otherwise, like, what does everybody need to bring to the table to make that work? So what are your final feelings and thoughts and advice even?
If you're going to adapt something, take time to learn it, then pick your intent. What is it that you want to really get out of the experience? Kind of like the way I've talked about this coin being double-sided. Is it that you want to get something crunchier, more instructive from your experience? And that could also be a fantasy setting, right? It doesn't have to be historical, but you can contrast that with something that's a lot more vibes-based, we'll call it, where it's more about the feelings. And I tend to apply my historical gaming to something that's much more like grounded and real. My two main periods are World War II. I dabble in the Dark Ages as my third period. I want to get more into that. And then the Ancients, Punic Wars. So those are my main things I like to do. And I like to know about them so that I can depict them in a way that's more rewarding. Punic Wars I know way less about than World War II, just because it's a totally different subject. But it's really cool. And by knowing about it, I can get more out of it. When I'm doing like the Horse Heresy and stuff, I have not read 65 paperback novels to know that whole series. I have not. I haven't even read every page of every rule book that's out there. Like, no. But I know enough, that I can extrapolate the vibes that I want. And the vibes that I want are that like crazy Baroque Roman space opera madness, grimdark battles. And it does all that.
Yeah, good point. All right, I guess we'll call it there. And please let us know if you have any thoughts and feelings about how to adapt things, your favorite adaptations of settings, specific games and whatnot, or whether you are someone that prefers to stay away from existing lore. And
are you a homebrew guy, right?
Yeah, like from scratch. So yeah, please, give us that engagement. We definitely love to see it, and we try to respond to as much as possible.
Yeah.
And I think that will do it. What are we doing for next episode?
Next episode, you know what? I'm going to tell you the truth. Next episode is we did not lock it in. We have a few ideas, actually. So we're on the workbench. I would say we're probably going to be revisiting a role-playing game again, because we've done a loop, right? We've run away from RPGs. Let's come back home. We'll talk about some dice throwing, and then maybe we can get. You know what? I would like to pair our adaptation talk here with maybe homebrew in a future episode. So maybe we'll see how that lines up.
Okay. Well, please stay tuned for the episode that comes up, and we will. Hopefully, it'll be a fun surprise for everybody.
Yeah, exactly. Even us.
Yeah. All right. Well, until then, happy gaming.
Happy gaming.
We hope you enjoyed delving into today's episode. A big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast, or on all popular podcast platforms. Join us again on the next exciting episode of Tales and Tactics.